So we're going to look today at different ways to compare fractions and decimals. So fractions with fractions and fractions with decimals, and some things that we can do to make this a little bit easier. So the first thing I want to show you is comparing two fractions. We can use the idea of just logic. Logic by just thinking in our brain, what would make sense? Which of these would be larger? One situation where we can do that is when we have numerators that are the same and denominators that are different. So you notice in this case that we have two numerators that are 1. That makes each of these fractions unit fractions. Remember, anytime we have a 1 in the numerator, we have a unit fraction. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that I have different denominators. Remember, my denominator tells me how many pieces that it takes to make a whole. So I know on the fraction to the left, 1/4, it takes 4 pieces to make a whole. The fraction to the right, it takes 8 pieces to make a whole. The reason that it takes more pieces to make a whole in 1/8 is because those pieces are smaller. If I were to draw a circle and look at what this would look like, this would be a fourth versus an eighth would look something like this. We can easily see here that an eighth is smaller. An eighth is actually half of a fourth. So if I were picking the larger fraction here, I would pick 1/4. Fewer pieces in the denominator means it's going to be larger pieces. And we can tell this that we have the same number of each of these, one of each of these pieces. So logic. Second way we can use logic is if we have two fractions that are similar in some ways. So for example, each of these fractions, I would say, are close to being one whole. For example, we know here in the denominator, in 3/4, we have a 4 in the denominator. It takes 3/4 to make a whole. That means we are only missing 1/4 here. Versus 5/6, we are missing 1/6. Now, although both of those are only missing one piece from being a whole, 3/4 is missing a larger piece than is 5/6. And we can visually look at this again in circles. So if we have 3/4, let me use a different color here. This would be 1, 2, 3/4. So the piece that isn't shaded is the piece that would be missing. That would be the 1/4. Versus in 5/6, again, we have 6 different pieces. I would shade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, you'll notice the missing piece here is smaller than the missing piece here. That is because 1/6 is smaller than 1/4. The same idea as the previous slide, unit fractions. This tells us then because 3/4 is missing a bigger piece, it is further from being one whole. Therefore, 5/6 is closer to a whole. It must be the bigger fraction. So using logic, we can tell a lot about which fractions are larger than others. A second strategy we can use if the logic piece is a little tough, we can use common denominators. Remember when we're using common denominators, the first thing we need to do is find our denominators. So here I have a 3, here I have a 4. Because my denominators are different, sometimes it makes fractions difficult to compare. One way to make common denominators, if I make a chart, you could say 3s and 4s, I am looking for the least common multiple. So I'm looking for a multiple, the smallest one that is the same. So first I'm going to count by 3s, 3, 6, 9, 12. And then I'm going to count by 4s, 4, 8, 12. And again, I'm looking for a match, which in this case is going to be 12. Because I found a match, I can take each of these. I know I'm multiplying 3 times 4 to get 12. I'm going to do the same to the top. 2 times 4 is 8. And over here, if I make it into 12, that's going to be 4 times 3 is 12. Same to the top, times 3. And I get 9. You'll notice that 2/3 is the same as 8/12. 3/4 is the same as 9/12. 9/12 is more than 8/12. So 3/4 must then be the bigger fraction. So common denominators can work. Same idea here. I have 5/6 and 2/3. Although I could figure this out with logic, notice they're each only missing one piece. 5/6 is missing only 1/6, a smaller piece, so it must be bigger. I can also do that with common denominators. Again, take my denominators. In this case, one of the denominators is going to be our least common multiple, which is 6. So I don't actually have to do anything to 5/6 because it's already in 6. I'm going to change 2/3. In this case, I'll multiply by 2, which gives me 4/6. I know that 5/6 is bigger than 4/6, so 5/6 must be bigger than 2/3. Common denominators is a good strategy. Next thing is changing a fraction into a decimal. Notice I have a decimal here, 34 hundredths. I have a fraction here, 2/5. If I want to compare these two numbers, one easy way is to change a fraction into a decimal. A way we can change a fraction into a decimal here, notice we have fifths. We don't have a fifths place for decimals, but one thing we can do is change this into either a 10, 100, or 1,000. I'm going to choose a 10 because it's easy to change a 5 into a 10. To get to a 10, I'm going to multiply by 2, do the same to the top. I figure out this is 4/10, which as a decimal looks like this. Now, in this case, we're much closer because we have two decimals. One thing, remember, that we can do, because this has two decimal places, it goes to the hundredths, is we can just add a 0. And we can see here that 40 hundredths is bigger than 34 hundredths. Therefore, 2/5 must be larger. They're close, but it must be larger. So changing fractions into decimals is a good way to compare two types of numbers. And another strategy we can use is more than half, deciding is a fraction more than half or is a fraction less than half, and we can do the same for a decimal. So we'll start with a fraction. If I were looking, let's do it in red. If I were looking at 7/8 and I were looking at 1/10, what I could do is say, are either of these more than half or are they less than half? Well, 7/8, I know that it takes 8/8 to make a whole. It would take half of that to make half. So 4/8 would be half. So 7/8 is more than half. So I'm going to say more than half. Versus 1/10, we know it takes 10/10 to make a whole, 5/10 to make half. So 1/10 is less than half. Just by using this really basic strategy, we can decide that 7/8 must be bigger. It's more than half versus 1/10 is less than half. And the last strategy, which is one that we'll use often, is putting numbers on a number line. And this is a strategy where you're just finding where does this number fit on that number line. And based upon that, we can decide which numbers are larger than others. And we can use all of the strategies that we've used up to this point to help us place numbers onto a number line. So just a real quick recap, we talked about using logic, using common denominators, using fractions and changing them into decimals, and lastly, deciding are numbers more than half or less than half. Using all of these, we should be able to tell which numbers are larger than others when we're comparing fractions and decimals.